welcome everyone to this fourth and final working conference session. We have had an incredible run and amazing feedback and insights and shares, and all working toward a greater purpose. And so we have an interesting lineup this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. So Garima is going to kick us off here, and she's going to be talking about integrating contemplative education in our educational models around the world. And this is the part I'm really interested in, is the implications for public policy. And a little different than what we've done in our past sessions, we will be having a discussion right after this, and then we'll go for a short break. And following that, our beloved Shiv will be having a short presentation on basically what we've discovered and unraveled and or what's the word I'm looking for? We'll say unraveled from the past sessions, and an overview of that and the next steps. And then we'll follow that by our beautiful Robin, and she will present, which I think will be helpful for everyone because the proposal was quite in-depth and lengthy. So Robin's going to present an abridged version of that, particularly for with a focus of presenting to one school. And then we want to open up the discussion again, because this is where a lot of the valuable sharing happens. So we've got a good chunk of time there to open up the discussion. And that is the plan for today. And so I thank everyone for, again, taking time out of your Sunday to be with us. So I will hand it over to Garima at this point. You've got the mic.
Great, thanks, Christine. So just before we get started, just so that everybody knows what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of public policy, and then we're going to get into the integration part, and that's where the discussion will really happen. Just as an introductory remark, I am in no ways an expert on public policy issues, and public policy impacts all of us each and every day in everything that we do. And so I really do encourage you to think about how public policy affects you in each and every day, but especially when we're talking about the concepts that we've been discussing throughout Shen. How do you integrate them into education models, whether they are public education programs or other types of education programs in this moment, in this cultural moment that we're in? I would invite you as we move forward. So just my slide here just takes a little bit of time. Okay. So I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. And while many of us are joining from across Canada and perhaps the world, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Toronto, and that I am on the historical territory of the Huron-Wendat, Petun, Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit Indigenous peoples. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. So I'm starting this presentation on contemplative education and how to integrate ideas of contemplative education into public policy, into public education systems and other education systems, by first asking us to, especially for those of us in North America, to acknowledge that the ways in which we talk about public policy often are from a colonial framework. And you'll recall that 4 sessions ago, this picture was introduced as And this is of a refugee camp in Lahore, I believe, after the partition of India and Pakistan. And so it was the partition of India and Pakistan that left Tayaji sort of questioning what makes people hate, and what is taught in our systems, be it religious, be it education, be it cultural systems, that teaches us to divide rather than unite. And I would say that in the Canadian public policy context, it's important to recognize that we're often talking about public policy from a colonial framework, and that the entire essence of public policy is in itself violent in itself. It's as if the Brits never left India and Pakistan to begin with. And so I share that with you I share that with you as important context setting, because it's something that I think as a group we often try to evade, but it's important to address head on, because it is the framework within which we're operating, and to understand that there is a duality or a tension between what we're discussing and the systems within which we're operating. Just trying to change my slide. Sorry, give me a second. I don't know why it's so delayed. My apologies. There we go. So the purpose of this presentation is to, as I've said, contextualize conversations around public policy, especially in Canada, provide a high-level description of policy actors and process, identify our own points of intervention as we think of integrating contemplative education in public policy or public education models and other education models. And then for the discussion, I want us to really discuss where we go from here as a group and as we take Shen's work forward. Sorry. Again, there's a lag. I'm not sure why. There we go. Okay, so according to Merriam-Webster, and this is again just, I'm setting the 101, the Foundations 101 of politics versus policy. So politics, which I think many of us sort of think about in our day-to-day lives and are often exposed to through the media that we consume, is the art or science of government. It's the art or science concerned with guiding or influencing government policy. And we often associate it with winning or holding control over a government. Policy is not mutually exclusive from the idea of politics, but it identifies a definitive course of action amongst alternatives that are presented to decision makers in light of given conditions, and to help move forward policy objectives. It can be a plan, and for it to actually come into effect needs to be made acceptable and then implemented by a governing body that could be a government, a state government, or a provincial government. It could also be the board of an organization within which you serve. Sorry, again, there's a delay. It only does this here. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay, so there are different layers of governance as we think about what different types of bodies affect the public policies that affect our everyday lives. So you've got the supranational, like the United Nations or the European Union. And they are government like bodies that are made up of representation of different government heads or national government heads. And there are government, or there are public policies that come from these supranational bodies that affect our everyday lives. So with the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights affects us every single day, depending on whether the country that you live in has actually adapted the UNDHR and other human rights treaties, and covenants, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. And so if you are in Canada, Canada is a signatory to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, within which the right to education, for example, exists, and is enumerated. But if you are in the United States, unfortunately, the United States is not a signatory to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Then you've got national governments. So again, in Canada, that would be our federal government, housed in Ottawa, with offices across, but our parliament being in Ottawa. And if you are in India, national government is housed in Delhi, of course, with offices throughout the country. And then you've got provincial or state level governments, and then local municipal governments, and you've got organizational layers of governance. So if you work within a school, or if you work within a university or a seminary, there are policies and regulations that affect how you do your work or how you learn. And all of these layers of governance have synergies between them. So if you are in Canada and you are a resident of the city of Toronto, like I am, the municipal services that are made available to me are often negotiated positions between what the province has deemed as acceptable jurisdiction for the city of Toronto. Just trying to change the slide again. So sorry. It'll work one day, I promise. Okay, so I'm going to focus this presentation on Canada, but I often think that because Canada is a federated state, the issues that I'll talk about in reference to Canada is relevant to the United States and in India, for example. So because Canada is a federated state, the responsibilities for policy vary by jurisdiction. So for example, education and health are in provincial jurisdiction. Defense and global affairs are in federal jurisdiction. While there is some overlap, it's usually around funding. And I bring this up because it's something that we, the collective, we often neglect to think about as we think about how we're going to move forward our public policy priorities, right? So if we're talking about contemplative education, whether the federal government has a minister for diversity or not, unfortunately, the response that you're going to get from a federal government official is that this is not within our area of jurisdiction, and you really ought to talk to your provincial official or provincial equivalent for the public policy change that you're seeking. And so when we're talking about the work of Shen, it's really important for us to hone in on who we're speaking to and what part of the overall package that we're presenting is going to be emphasized. So if we're talking about education or health and well-being outcomes, then we really have to think about the province as our main area of focus. or you think about actual service providers, be they education, or sorry, schools or other educational institutions, or community or the community sector writ large. And it could be community centers, which house different types of community programs. But you're actually, if you go in with, we've got an idea that could change, or to introduce curricular change into education models throughout Canada, that's actually not going to be a welcome idea by a federal government. And so by our federal government, because they just don't have, that's not their area of jurisdiction. And there is no urgency around this issue. There is no perceived urgency around this issue. So the flip side right now in Canada, childcare, which does fall under provincial jurisdiction, is becoming a federal area of concern, because it's a national concern now, and it is urgent. But of course, it requires the agreement of provincial and territorial governments to actually make any movements forward. So I'm spending time here to discuss what a federated state what the realities of a federated state look like for public policy imperatives, because we often ignore them. And I am sure that in speaking with my policy colleagues in the United States and in India, that the issues tend to be the same. In India, government policy is much more centralized than it is here. And so you don't face these issues to the same extent. But again, for us to be really clear on who we're talking to and when, and what is the communication emphasis, is really important. And I'd also say that, well, the 1 second, I did not need this slide to change so quickly. I'd also say that it's important to think about what the federal government can or cannot do, because if you do see an ally in the federal government, be it in the United States or in Canada, the emphasis then might actually be on something else outside of education and health. And so keeping our sight lines really clear is important. Many of you, I think, intuitively know this, but it's always helpful to outline this. There is a difference between political and policy leadership in Canada, especially, and in governments across the world. And so if you are talking about details of what it is that you are seeking, you often want to talk to the policy leadership. If you want to talk about getting agreement in principle around what you're talking about, you often want to start with political leadership. And there is no sequential order of policy change. If there's one thing that I could get across from this conversation, is that we need to be working with a multi-pronged strategy with different actors, engaging with different actors, depending on our own areas of expertise. So under political leadership, the head of our governments are the premiers of the provinces and territories, or the prime minister of the country. Then the premier or prime minister have their own offices with advisors that advise them on issues and policy decisions that they need to be made aware of and need to be making. Then you've got cabinet, which is made up of ministers responsible for certain portfolios and departments, or state secretaries if you're in the United States. The secretary or minister has their own offices, and then they also have their own constituency office. Of course, if you're in the United States, your Secretary of State, Defense, or Health and Human Services don't have constituency offices, because they don't necessarily need to be elected to be in the positions that they're in. And then in Canada, if you're a member of Parliament but not in cabinet, then you're part of your party's caucus, and this caucus is made up of MPPs or MPs and their constituency office. In parallel, you've got a whole civil service organization led by the Secretary of Cabinet or the Clerk of the Privy Council if you're in Ottawa. And the line ministries are made up of deputy ministers. So line ministries include specific areas like education, health, correctional services. And the hierarchy is deputy, ADMs, directors, managers, and staff. And then where the real, I don't want to say where decisions are made, but where a lot of the funding decisions are made, or where the funding decisions are made, are in central agencies. And central agencies include finance, treasury board, and cabinet office. And so again, when we're thinking about moving Shen's work forward, I want to spend a lot of time here for us to think about what, we need to start to get a little bit more crisp with what we're asking, because idea generation is only going to get us so far. That might only lend us some political head nodding, but to get really crisp with any type of regulatory change or any type of space change that we're asking for in terms of time is a decision that is probably going to be led by a Minister of Education, for example. But if that has cost implications, then we also need to be aware of where in the central agency framework, so in finance, cabinet office, or in treasury board, where decisions around funding are being made, because the Ministry of Education can only make proposals for how it wants to increase its spending or spend, but the ultimate decision really is made in central agencies, and then together decisions are then fed up to cabinet for cabinet to make a final decision. So again, in speaking about policy as being both an art and a science, it's not enough for us to just continuously talking about the values and that are behind the work of Shen. We actually need to be quite strategic about how we go about moving on policy change. And the one time I wanted to move, it's not moving. Okay, I am sorry. There we go. So I've talked about this, so I won't go through it some more. And this brings me to policy influencers, because we've talked, so by we, I've talked a lot about the different ways in which policy happens, and from a colonial framework, what does a hierarchy of political and policy leadership look like? But of course, there are many influencers that go into a decision that is being made. It's not so, it's fortunately or unfortunately, depending on the day I'm in, not so simple as a line ministry versus central ministry decision. So as discussed, cabinet, caucus, parliamentary assistants, and political staff and opposition parties have a lot of sway in what happens in government decision making. Central agencies have a lot of sway in what happens in the policy sphere and in government decision making. We haven't spent a lot of time on courts and quasi-judicial bodies, but I do think that it's important to talk about, because what courts in Canada, at the very least, say about what is legal or not goes a long way in informing the types of public policies that we have. Of course, the media is a really significant policy influencer. So if you are in government, you're working 24 hours a day because the media is working 24 hours a day, and news stories can break at any moment. And so the ways in which the media communicate what the problem and what the proposed solution is really helps to influence what the broader public is thinking. Then you've got think tanks and different specialty groups like Shen, and you've got advocacy groups. Sorry. On this, I would just say that as my slide changes, that we can see ourselves as we think of our strategic policy work. I think we need to ask ourselves, how well are we doing in I think we've got our own expertise. Shen has its own expertise as a specialty group or as a think tank, but maybe some more work needs to be done in influencing these other policy influencers that affect policy change. And my slide will change just in a second, I'm sure it will. There we go. And very quickly, just so that you've got a very simplified idea of what the policy process in Canada can look like, either at a provincial or at a federal level. A policy idea is often announced either through a platform, a throne speech, through active advocacy between these moments, or an emerging idea and problem. So right now, in the midst of COVID, a number of emerging issues have been brought to bear, and governments and the public have to grapple with them. Once the ideas are surfaced, you've got stakeholders that are ready with policy ideas that are starting to influence different line ministries responsible. So it could be the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education. You've also got the media that are starting to inform the public about the issue at hand. And so if you are an effective stakeholder, you're not only doing your government relations work, but you're also trying to work with media to educate them and inform them about the work, about the facts on the ground around the issue that's come up, or that is arising ever so slowly. In line ministries, they have their own processes for approvals. And then once a line ministry sort of, is comfortable with proceeding with a policy idea and has the legal, the fiscal, and the policy and regulatory issues sort of figured out, and that can be a fast process or that can be a very slow process. They eventually move on to something called four corners, where where the central agencies that I talked about and the line ministry start to talk about what the policy idea is, and the policy idea goes through some more reform and tinkering. And then there are central agency approvals, and once central agencies approve, then it goes to cabinet, and cabinet, of course, has its own regulatory committees, or its own committees, and it can be a legislative and regulatory committee, it can be a health and social committee, and cabinet committees can inform changes in the ideas. And if that happens, you go all the way back to the beginning of the process. And if all is good at cabinet committee, you can proceed with cabinet, where cabinet has a decision to either approve or not the policy ideas that are put before them, and then they go back to the beginning for further refining. And then if there's a legislative change, there will be legislative change announced in the House and Parliament, which will go through different readings in the House, and a budget announcement could either, again, this is very simplified, and so a circle should really be replaced with arrows bouncing back and forth between each of the boxes. But a budget announcement publicly helps the government, or helps the public know what the government is proposing, how much it is thinking of spending, and why it is proposing the policy change that it is. Sorry, there we go. So I've spoken at a very, 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 very high level about public policy processes and change, and have peppered my comments with some ideas of how Shen might want to think about the work that it does as it moves forward on strategic policy change. And if there are some questions that I could lead you or leave you with, it would probably be the following. I'd like to affirm that policy is both an art and a science, as much as people would like to think that governing is boring and the process of public policy is boring and that politics is for people with their head in the clouds. It's anything but. It requires a lot of courage and guts to be able to think about what change you want to see for the communities that you live in, recognizing that different stakeholders have different bottom lines, and effective governing requires being able to manage all of your stakeholder expectations. And if you can't manage all of your stakeholder expectations, how are you going to support them in them being okay with the policy change that you're being in? Some things can be just about, absolute values. So if something is absolutely racist or sexist or homophobic, then as a governing entity, you create policy change that reduces those inequities and that violence, and it comes at a cost of frustrating some stakeholders, and that should be okay. In the work of Shen, I'd say that we need to be thinking about, or Shen needs to be thinking about, recognizing all of the different entities that are going to be perhaps opposed is too strong of a word, but not in agreement with the work that Shen is proposing. And so our work is actually in thinking about reaching out to those groups ourselves and proactively engaging those groups. And if not, then how do we set government up for success in being able to say, we know that XYZ group is not going to be in support, and here are some communications, or here's why, even if they don't support, we think you should still support our idea because this is how it will actually create positive change. And again, that requires not only a more scientific understanding of the policy process, but an art in communications, and an art in engagement. And this then leads me to a very high level list of what I think are some key ingredients for policy change. And I'd like us to all think about how Shen is doing with some of these key ingredients. So while we often try to think about policy change being top down, with governments, through edict telling us what policy change is going to be, often that policy change only happens if there is a normative or cultural change that's also taking place that allows political leadership to recognize that change needs to be made, and it makes their own lives easier by making this change. So I'll give you an example right now. In Alberta, the United Conservative Party, just as a party, announced a policy change around introducing or thinking of introducing more two-tiered healthcare. And while that might be aligned with the United Conservative Party's principles, I would hazard a guess that most Canadians are culturally opposed to a two-tiered health system. And so even a governing party internally has put forward a policy position that it in principle believes with, but in terms of the key ingredients for policy change, the normative and cultural change aspect, I think it's failing on, because as Canadians, we believe in public health care as an important driver for equity and equality. And so there's a tension here, and you can see it playing out in real time today when I woke up this morning on Sunday morning. Is there public awareness and support for the work that you're doing? Preparation, do we know what we're talking about? And do we know how to adjust what we're talking about based off of the audience that we have? So if we're speaking to a minister of education at the provincial level, how does our messaging change if we then have another meeting with the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion at the federal level the next day? Are we adjusting with the times? So I think in this moment with COVID, while there's a pandemic going on, there's also in the public health world what we often call a syndemic. So different systems of inequity are coming to bear at the same time, or different pandemics are coming to bear at the same time. So a pandemic around racism, a pandemic around COVID in itself, income inequalities are all synergistically sort of existing at the same time and exposing some grave health and social inequities. And that leads us, and I won't get into this discussion too much, but it often requires policy actors to think about the intersectional natures and intersectional identities of people. So for myself, as somebody that is a racialized woman, able-bodied, the ways in which I experience the world is different with somebody that does not share those same identities. And some part of my identity has privilege associated with it, and some of my identity does not. And I want to talk about intersectional identity because it can come at odds with something that Shen has sort of, I don't think purposefully is against, I don't think Shen is against the idea of intersectional identities. But when we talk about identity violence, we need to be really clear about the type of language that we're using, because entities in power that take advantage of dividing people by identity is different, and that is identity violence. That's different than recognizing the different intersectional identities that people have. And so when I say we need to adjust with the times, I think, you know, some of our communications actually needs to be in considering how we talk about contemplative education within these realities. Do we have allies and sector support and not so obvious partners as we move forward with our work? Do we have effective communication? And then lastly, I think, is the question around political leadership. I think we first need to ask ourselves, how are we doing on the rest of the key ingredients before we move forward with the political leadership question? And so I'll leave it at that for now and open it up to a discussion for about 20 minutes, and just to hear everyone's immediate thoughts. Again, I don't pretend to be an expert whatsoever, and am also learning on my own personal learning about contemplative education and getting deeper in Shen's work. But this is how I've sort of thought about the public policy questions with Shen's work.
Wow, thank you, Garima. I'd say you're the expert here. That's a whole world of information that is very foreign to me. I don't know about others in the group. And yeah, what definitely resonated, and this goes not just in creating policy, but changing the message based on the audience, right? Who are we talking to and what do they care about? So that's a huge piece. And what I got from this is that we have a lot of work to do still, and it's not going to happen overnight. So are there any questions or comments, helpful suggestions that could help us navigate this intricate and involved process that we are heading into with this. Let me see. You can raise your hand on the screen or in the participant panel. Hello, Milt. Welcome.
Yeah, I wonder if there isn't a way to make this easier in concert with the work that we're doing. It seems to me that we have a terrible ethic to change in modernity, and that's a lot about what interfaith education is all about. And I would think that it revolves around the notion of living by guiding principles and living by uncompromised guiding principles in some cases. And I just wonder if we make this an important part of what we're doing, if it doesn't simplify the governance, because the complications of governance to a large degree come about because people are protecting an unethical way of being. And what I mean by that is that the work that we're doing is all about earth ethics, ecological integrity, and communal harmony. And we compromise those ethics with virtually every economic decision we make. And I would think that the interfaith education piece would surface those ethics in such a way that people would make different decisions and easier decisions. And we can look back to the people that Garima acknowledged in the first place, and how do they make their council decisions? What do they base them on? To keep the earth in balance and harmony, which I think is fundamental to the interfaith work that we're doing.
I was on mute. Thank you, Milt. Garima, do you have anything to say in response?
Yeah, I think on that, something that I skirted around is the reality that education systems, by and large, I will say, at least in Canada, are made to help ensure that students are ready for the workforce, right? And so whether you're in high school or whether you're in post-sec, the reality of education systems is that an emphasis is placed on ensuring that you are receiving the skills, training, and knowledge you need to be able to go out and work. And so Milt, when you talk about, every economic decision goes against what in principle should be about protecting and promoting ecological safety, I think that if we recognize that about our education system, it forces us to think around if you can't integrate, if there's not going to be, and this is perhaps, this just needs to be said point blank, there is not going to be an instance in any public policy world where one policy announcement is going to change how every government does what it does. And so I think we need to lose the idea that that a pronouncement at the federal level or provincial level is going to create any meaningful change when it comes to the education that we receive. And Milt, to your point then, I think that we need to be a little bit more creative about what we're thinking about. So if the basis in which, if the basis from which you're coming from is from a climate action perspective, then are the allies that we build around creating that normative and cultural change actually in working with climate action partners, right? And that's a whole different set of stakeholders and community actors that is I imagine is not something that many people in the interfaith world actively engage with. But I think we need to be more, or Shen would need to be a lot more focused in that interaction to be able to take advantage of the normative change that climate action advocates are creating. And so I'll leave my comments at that.
Thank you. Daryl, I saw you had your hand up. Just to unmute your mic there. And Bill, you're next in line. I see your hand up in the chat. Go ahead, Daryl.
Morning, and thank you for your presentation this morning. I'm going to put my first question to you in a very simple way. How many pages should a policy proposal be? And I mean that quite literally, so that we need to sort of pare it down to be, so it's not longer than 3 or 4 pages, or is it 2? Okay, it's 2. I think that's very helpful to know what we're doing. The second question, partly a comment, is it helpful for a policy statement going forward to have endorsements other than Shen standing behind it? So that, for example, I think about our situation in Waterloo. If at some point we would be able to ask Interfaith Grand River if they would support the Shen proposal, or we have members of Parliament who, would we be able to name them as people who are supportive of the initiative? So I'm just trying to sort of get a fix on what we're looking at, what we're needing to do to even begin this kind of policy approach. It would seem to me that we could get affirmation from other interfaith or other cultural groups or other educational groups for what we could do, but we could get them at a local level, not at, universal level.
Yeah, I think, Daryl, that those are all, sorry, I'm just going to interject here. Those are all really great questions. And I think that you're spot on, right? People in decision-making, and I don't mean big decision-making, I mean decision-making in terms of just acting as the traffic cop that sort of says, okay, yeah, this person will take this meeting or not. They don't have more time. They have only 2 minutes to make a decision. And so anything longer than 2 pages is not going to be read. So I would say, again, it depends on the audience that you're speaking about. So in my own work, if we're proposing legislative change and actually the policy we're at the policy process of actually working through the legislative change, what we come forward with is actually working with the lawyers that are doing the legislative, that are documenting the language change. And so the pieces of paper that we put forward are much longer and much more involved. But I will say the shorter the document, the more involved the work actually gets, because you have to be really, really, really deliberate about what's in and what's out. And those are trade-off decisions.
All right.
And, to your question of, is it helpful for Shen to get different sector partners to be signatories or to endorse the proposal? I think that's absolutely correct, as much as our own individual names show community support. Being able to show these partnerships, I think, is far more effective. And if we can branch out to not so obvious partners, that also helps to make the case a bit stronger.
Awesome. Okay, Bill, Stephen, and then Bob.
Hi, is my mic is okay now?
Yep.
Okay, I'm just dealing a little bit with the concept of language and how we frame the proposals. And I think that I think there is aversion to anything that's presented in the context of a change. And I think to frame it in terms of restoring traditional values is much more powerful. The right wing in this country with Reagan recognized the power of just calling something traditional, and then people accepted it. And it's a very powerful bioneurological impact. It's very forceful. Bioneurology from the bioneurology. It's coming out. You got the idea from the point of the recipient. So rather than to introduce it as a change, I think that we might introduce it as restoring the traditional, avoid new, and again, talk about tradition that has been forgotten. You know, we're restoring the ancient tradition, you know, and how we do it is, I think, the appeal of what we're saying will be broader if we can couch it, our proposals in terms of restoring what was in the traditional sense, than introducing something new age, which scares everybody. That's all.
I mean, I'll just say really quick, Bill, that like the idea of tradition as a millennial and a woman just made me like kind of nauseous and nervous. And so again, I you know, if there's anything, it's about recognizing the audience that you're speaking to, because just from my own perspective, like that would, if I was a gatekeeper in which meeting my boss is going to have or not, I probably would just say no to that, right? If I was political, but if I was a civil servant, it would be my job to be able to then look at the 2-page note and be able to say, let me sort of figure out what are the facts behind this, and then present it. So again, just coming back to audience and recognizing for whom, you know, so for the Reaganites, that type of language might hold really well. But for Gen Z and millennials, it might not. Fine.
Comes back to the audience. Absolutely. Okay, Stephen, and thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much, Garima, for these very experienced answers. Building on Daryl's question, I'm wondering about the most feasible entry points for us at mid to lower level. And what I'm sort of schematicizing is there's partnering with institutions such as school boards, and there's partnering with like-minded organizations, or there's appearing in front of government at the local level. That means going in front of a city meeting and speaking for 2 minutes. But there's also appearing in a committee that covers a larger geographic area. What, in your opinion, are our most feasible entry points?
I think both in terms of feasibility, practice, and in developing the type of momentum you want, I would start at the local level, right? Because I think at local level politics and policy, people want to build community, and people see what, even though local governments have the least amount of power when it comes to fiscal decisions and how they spend the money that they have so little of. It's the type of government that the average person most interacts with, right? And so a 2-minute presentation or a 5-minute presentation at a council committee could actually be much more purposeful in terms of developing relationships with like-minded people or not like-minded people that are in your local community, and then you sort of build that momentum up, as opposed to presenting at the Senate or at the federal Senate, for example, which is is a very privileged thing to be able to do. But of course, many people don't engage with the work that the Senate does, right? It's so far from the average everyday lives that people experience. So my answer would be to start local government. I think if you can get a board, a school board on board, it really helps because, or a local school on board, it really helps because you start to show, you start to demonstrate the change that you're talking about, rather than these large edicts from larger governments, which can be transformational if there is political leadership behind it, but often because there's so much other stuff going on competing for attention, it gets lost in the mix.
So it seems to me that part of the preparation process is finding out people's schedules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. Emails and schedules.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, Bob, and then Robin.
Yeah, actually, Garima has already said most of what I wanted to say, but just at least in Ontario, I mean, educational policy is essentially divided between two levels, which are the province and the school board level. So I think starting locally would mean starting at the school board level, and that if a school board were sort of behind this, and if a school board kind of implemented it, and that could be, you know, it could be shown to have been successful at a school board level, then it would have, it would be much more likely to catch the attention of, you know, people in the Ministry of Education at the provincial level. And I mean, you know, in terms of sort of what the proposal will be, I mean, you know, the first question is whom the proposal is for. I mean, and like Daryl's question about how long it should be, you know, depends on sort of how close that person is to sort of this specific area of policy. So, you know, like actually writing the proposal is part of a whole strategy. It can't be divorced from the, you know, whom are we approaching and what are we asking for?
Great. Thank you, Bob. Robin? I muted you. I wasn't sure if it was your background that was making noise, so just unmute yourself there. Oh, still can't hear you, Robin. There we go.
Okay. Hi. I wanted to remind everybody that we are going to talk about a localized proposal at the end, and a lot of these discussions are going to fit right into that because, you know, we've got some big plans. She wants us to be worldwide, and we have areas that we can address that, like at Parliament, World Religions, or North American Interfaith Network, trying to get presentations across into big groups so it would be sympathetic to our cause. But I think we all agree that we need to start small and give the sort of rock in the pond situation where you drop the pebble in, and then, you know, obviously the ripple effect will spread. And so I hope all of you had a chance to read the other proposal that I put together that's shorter and a little bit more pulling on the heartstrings, which we will present to, you know, maybe small private schools, maybe homeschooling companies that create curriculum, maybe Montessori schools, maybe creating a sort of a release time or special class that's available but not required in some of the schools to let us to get in and try it out in a smaller local type situation. So I think we're all pretty much in agreement with that, and we can talk about it more at the end.
Thank you, Robin. Definitely sounds good. Okay, are there any other comments, suggestions, questions regarding what we've heard from Garima? Just raise your hand. You can do it in the participant panel or on screen. Shiv.
Christine, I've been listening to Garima and I've been thinking in my own mind, the complexity of the job is horrendous. What I think we have to look at is a whole system level. Although the approaches can be many, but ultimately it has to be a system-wide change. Because if we start at one level only, we need the support of the other levels to even work at one level. Let us say if we start at the primary school level, we need a lot of teachers to teach this thing. And where are the teachers to teach contemplative education? How many teachers really do contemplate themselves? What is their experience in contemplation at all? Contemplation is a practical thing, and you can't teach a practical subject with a theoretical knowledge only. So it's not simply an educational initiative, it is a basic change in the policy of education. What we're talking about is not only educating to fill in factory jobs or fill in for education for jobs alone, for education for life. Life includes jobs, but it also includes human relationships. It also includes, social relationships. There are so many other sides to life than just looking for a job. And what we are looking at is a fulfilled life, a life where we do things with proper understanding and a holistic way of looking at things. And a holistic way of looking at things, you're looking at various problems at the same time. For example, what we're proposing, we are looking at race relations, we are looking at interfaith relations, we are looking at environmental activities. We are looking at learning ability. We are looking at health and whatever, because they're all related. And what our governance is based upon a kind of a reductionistic approach. We look at one thing at a time, not a connection between different things. And even our healthcare is based upon a reductionistic approach of body and mind being two separate entities, unconnected with each other. So if something goes wrong with the body, you treat it like a machine. Put some grease and oil and stuff like that, and tighten some screws here and loosen some screws there, and let it go. It doesn't work like that. Life is, mind and body are so interrelated. So all diseases, for example, of the body are related with the situation of the mind, unless it's an invasion from a foreign object, like a virus. So it's a different way of thinking.
Yeah. Okay, we are at 5 minutes after. Garima, did you want to have a quick final word?
Sure, just very quickly. I would say, Thayaji, I think you're speaking to the choir right now, right? We're all part of the converted. So our work moving forward, and Shen's work moving forward, is in trying to figure out how do you communicate that. I think people intrinsically know that, but we all work for organizations that produce the fault lines that you've been talking about, right? The separation of mind and body, the separation of being kind to our environment and working in spaces that lead to the degradation of our environment. So the work is very crisply figuring out how do you communicate what we're talking about, and how do you engage people that are not obvious actors. And so I want to keep going back to that point, because I think if you're able to get like a Chamber of Commerce like entity to even listen to what you have to say, again, at a personal level, I think many people will resonate with the ideas that are shared by Shen, but it's that organizational shift that needs to take place. And I'd also remind people that government officials, whether they're civil servants or political actors, are only human beings. They can only make decisions based off of the information that they have, and they also only have 24 hours a day. So as much as we all agree that we need systematic change, I think we need to be a bit pragmatic about how we go about the change that we're talking about, because otherwise it's kind of like, you know, screaming off the top of a mountain. Sure, you're screaming, but nobody's actually hearing you. So I'll leave it at that, and not to be too pragmatic about really important things, but strategy requires it sometimes.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
So let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll reconvene at 18 minutes after the hour.